things are getting bad in Canada. There have been a lot of things going on in the last week, and I want to update you in today's live show. And of course, if you have any questions or anything you want to share, put in the comments, and I'll be happy to try to answer all the questions in today's episode. So let's talk about what's happened. Big tax reform in Canada, first in headline. Then I'll talk about rate cuts. I'll talk about rate hikes potentially. I'll talk about some of the economic data on inflation. But first, let's get into the tax changes. Big tax reform, the biggest tax reform in Canada since the 1930s. Since between World War I and World War II, we haven't had this big of a tax reform in Canada. There's some big changes coming in terms of real estate. One of the big headline news pieces was around capital gains tax inclusion rate. They are raising the capital gains tax inclusion rate in Canada on every dollar of capital gains earned inside of any corporation or trust from 50% inclusion to nearly 66.67%. From 50% to 66.67%. That is a huge, huge difference in terms of what Canadians are currently expecting. It's going to have big implications for how wealth is transferred. And more importantly, there's some verbiage in the new tax I guess it's proposed plan, but it's going to be read into action. I believe June 25th is the deadline for trying to lock in any capital gains before these new changes. June 25th, 2024. Big changes. It's going to have big impacts in Canada. Currently, there's an incentive actually for people to sell. So I think we may see some people selling stocks they've been holding for a long time to lock in and get the lower capital gains tax inclusion rate. Now, in your personal name, up to $250,000 before that increase from 50% inclusion to 66.67. It's going from 50% inclusion to 2/3 included, fully taxed at your top marginal bracket, which is a big difference in terms of, I think, how people plan their current wealth trajectories. Interestingly, it used to be that inside of a corp, inside your personal name, if you held a property or a stock or, your cryptocurrency or whatever asset, when you sell that asset, there'd be a capital gain. And it used to be such that there wasn't such a penalty to do that. And in fact, it's interesting, in Canada, we have no 1031 exchange. So if you want to sell one underperforming asset and buy another one, you pay the full tax to switch assets. So sell a property, buy another property, full tax. In the United States, you can transfer those gains and roll into another asset. It's designed to encourage the capitalist and the producing people of the nation to produce more, to keep the capital moving. What Canada is doing instead is saying, hey, don't sell any of your assets because we'll tax the shit out of them. Instead, keep your cash locked into underperforming assets. We don't want job creation. We don't really care about the economy. What we want is to siphon from the 1%. This is designed to siphon from those who provide and create wealth in Canada. What is that going to do? It's going to force those people to flee Canada. It's going to push the capital out of Canada. It's going to encourage, well, to some extent, probably some tax evasion and tax fraud, and probably also going to encourage some people to do things like leave Canada entirely, or capital to flee, or people looking to invest in places like Canada to not invest in Canada. So it's going to cause an excess of capital. It's going to cause capital to become performing less efficiently. We want capital to flow freely. We want, if someone has a project that has a huge tax liability associated with it, we want to reduce that to the extent that we will offer credits and opportunities for them to redeploy that capital to create jobs, to grow the economy. Now people are going to be stuck with assets because they're afraid to sell and to pull out the capital associated with that. So that's some big changes. Inflation actually in Canada, interesting. The economy is not strong here. Weekly data we're looking at is not strong by any means. We're definitely struggling in terms of our GDP. It is not doing well. Our debt per capita is some of the highest in the entire world. We're number one in terms of credit card debt and debt per capita. So Canadians are suffering. And on top of that, the new Ontario government rules around the minimum wage have increased the minimum wage 15 and 20% over the last couple of years. Minimum wage getting close to almost $18 Canadian per hour. So you've got these challenges. On one hand, the Bank of Canada came out today and said, hey, we're going to stop quantitative tightening. And then the Fed came in and said, we're actually going to buy up all that mortgage debt. We're going to buy up all that bond debt. So that was interesting, as well as interesting new development in the last week. That's another big piece. The Fed is basically stepping in and saying, hey, like the federal government is going to come in and start buying these bonds because the Bank of Canada can't afford to. And so that was really interesting too. It's a sign of the times. It's a sign that our balance sheet is out of control. It's a sign that rates need to fall in Canada very badly. Our economy is not in a good position. We definitely need to have those rate cuts. I foresee we're going to have rate cuts probably by Labor Day at the latest in Canada. They will start cutting. I also foresee this playing out to Canada potentially getting to 50 cents on the dollar relative to the United States dollar. I could see our currency as we cut first because our economy is weak compared to the United States economy, which is driven largely by tech, and they're also not afraid to allow a little pollution. In Canada, we're like, hey, we're a naturally resource-rich, strong country. Like the things we were good at, we're producing some of the largest, we have some of the largest reserves of fresh water, of lumber. We have tons of oil in our oil sands out in Alberta, and we just have an abundance of great resources. Like we're a wealthy nation, one of the largest countries in terms of actual raw resources and good usable land in the world. In fact, Russia is the only country bigger than us, and a lot of their land is like Siberia, right? It's not very great land for growing things or that sort of thing. So Canada actually the #1 in the world in terms of raw potential, in my opinion, under some of the worst management I've ever seen. Just some terrible policy decisions that are going to affect my children in a way that I don't think people are really accepting or recognizing on the left side of the spectrum. They're just not thinking about the future. They're thinking about now. And they say that, it's like this whole pollution argument. That's been the whole thing, is like, oh, we're gonna just punish the rich. We're gonna punish the industry. We're not gonna develop Canada's natural resources that we have. We're gonna focus specifically on effectively letting Canada run to be potentially a bottom 20 of the top 20 countries, and letting Canada really kind of devalue in the global stage. And I think a lot of that is around this message that we're focused on the future of anti-pollution. And it's like, well, you think we're all just going to drive less because you put some new tax in? It actually doesn't really work that way. What happens is the pollution is just created across the border. So, here in Ontario, we border a lot of the United States. They'll just produce more, or Mexico, or India, or China. These other countries will just produce more. If we make it expensive to produce and manufacture in Canada, they'll just manufacture elsewhere. It's not like, anyway, I'm probably saying this ad nauseum. I don't want to get political on this channel, but I have to. If someone doesn't say something, I don't know where Canada is going to go as a country. It's a beautiful country with a lot of really great people. It's an amazing culture in a lot of ways. I mean, immigration has changed that more recently substantially. We had immigration targets that were exceeded by 100% in 2023. We exceeded our immigration targets by 100%. They're like, we actually didn't even realize how many people actually came to Canada. They were doing the census data, and they're like, oh, there's hundreds of thousands of students and refugees. We didn't realize we were taking in this many students. It's like, what? You don't even keeping track how many people you're letting in? I'm all for immigration, but I want to see immigration for the right kind of people. I want to see people who are a cultural fit for Canada, people who will come and add something to the country. Everyone has something to add, but some add less than others. And I hate to say that. That sounds unfair. Maybe we're getting into like some philosophical thing about humans all being equal. Humans are not all equal. Some people are better producers. Some people are criminals. They come to a country and all they do is create crime and problems. We don't want those people. We want people who are going to come to the country and are going to love Canada. We're going to absorb our cultural values, not pretend that their country has come here. We want to accept people who want to come, and we want to grow in Canada. And I think there's some real problems brewing. I think it's all at a spearhead led by our fearless trust fund baby, drama teacher, most unqualified prime minister we've ever had in Canadian history. The only prime minister in Canadian history who doesn't have at least a master's in economics degree and a law degree, to which he has neither. And every prime minister before him in history for over a century has had a law degree, because you have to understand the law in order to write new law. And of course, an understanding of economics, again, which he has none. He couldn't even hack it as a drama teacher, which is the easiest type of teacher to be in high school. Anyway, I don't want to get into all that. He's a trust fund baby, whatever. The Liberal Party is placating to the bottom half. And let me talk a little bit about that too, because it's important. And I'm not forgetting about the bottom half. Canadians are suffering. My God, the people in the bottom half are suffering right now in a way that we haven't seen such income disparity in decades, maybe even a century, where there's been this bad for the bottom half. The top 10% of Canadians are doing really well. They're richer than they've ever been. Their stocks are all doing well. Their real estate, again, hit more recently in a bad way, but in general, doing much, much better. But the bottom, I guess, quarter or the bottom third are hit most acutely by inflation. Remember, if everything inflates in value, how does that affect the most? Well, if you have assets and you have leverage and debt applied to your assets, as things inflate in value, if houses go up, if rent goes up, if your cost of your food goes up 50%, you don't care as much because everything goes up with it, meaning all your assets that you own go up with it. But people on fixed income, people who can't ride the wave of inflation are effectively taxed. It's a lifestyle tax. And that's what happens when you have bad management in a country. You get really bad inflation. And unfortunately, in Canada, we're landing between the rock and the hard place. The hard place being bad economic times and recession. So we don't have the strong, robust economy the United States has. We're actually suffering in a way that they aren't. Again, largely led by the fact that in Canada, we don't have 30-year fixed rate mortgages. Most people have 1 and 2 year fixed and variable rate debt. So when rates went up like this parabolically, Canadians who are very, very indebted, some of the most indebted, I think the stat is we're the most indebted of anyone in the G20 in terms of per capita. I think anyone in the world, I think we're the top most indebted if I have that fact right, either by credit card debt or just in general debt. I'm pretty sure it's just consumer debt. If you include real estate too, because our real estate market is so hot, again, per capita, we have some insane levels of debt. And unfortunately, that debt is floating at levels that are way too high for the average Canadian to sustain. If you have a house in Toronto right now with an average mortgage of $1.1 million at a 7% or prime rate 7.25%, you're looking at like $80,000 a year in interest. $90,000 a year in interest. Most people after tax, if they make 120 grand a year, in Canada, they net like 70 grand at best. They can't even pay the interest only on their mortgage. That's not property taxes, utilities. That's not maintenance on the home. They just can't afford to live. And then rents have gone crazy because what are landlords going to do when you bring in rent control and you regulate their environment and you don't let them have any capital gains because you tax the shit out of everything. And then they're afraid to rent out their property because the tenant rights are so strong, it takes a year just to get a trial. So what are they going to do? Well, you can't Airbnb anymore. The government's now come after that too. They're saying, hey, if you rent a property out on Airbnb in Toronto, Vancouver, London, Ontario, in an area where it's restricted, we will not allow you any deductions. The CRA has come out and said, we will not allow any deductions unless you can show a valid Airbnb rental license. They're even going after re-rental. If you rented a house and then re-rented an Airbnb, they're saying those expenses, all of them, are non-allowable expenses. That means the CRA is effectively saying, we will tax you at 100% on your revenue because we're not going to give you any expenses. So if you had $10,000 in Airbnb income and you had $9,000 in expenses, utilities and furniture and staffing to clean it and whatever Airbnb fees, we'll not allow any of those fees that you paid. Meaning that $10,000 you collected in rent, we're going to tax it all as if it's income. They're coming after the people who generate the jobs and generate the productivity. It's ass backwards. It's not how you grow an economy. It's the worst management I think I've ever seen in a G7 nation. I mean, we're not as bad as like India or some of the corruption in some of those other countries, so I gotta be thankful. Canada is not the worst that it could be, but it's really not performing anywhere near as good as it could be. And so for that, my heart hurts. And as a born lover of Canada, I don't want to leave, but I think I'm going to be forced to leave Canada on, cultural issues, on tax issues, for the future of my kids. I might have to plant flags in other countries too. Maybe Costa Rica, maybe Bahamas. There are other countries where it makes more sense, I think, for the wealthy to move their wealth and to produce jobs and produce in the economy. People will go where people are rewarded, right? At the end of the day, I tend to believe that people do what is best for themselves. Unfortunately, I wish that wasn't the case. I wish that humans were altruistic and they love to pay tax and they love to work for no incentive. Here, I'll give you an example of just a failure in this current tax system. I'll give you an example for a middle-class worker. I was just doing my taxes, so I'm well aware of some scenarios. So I mapped out on their calculator on the government's website. If you're a family with three kids, I have 3 kids, so I was just looking at 3 kids as an example. And you were, a doctor or a dentist here in Canada, and you made $150,000 a year in your corporation, $200,000 a year in your corporation, and you were to take a paycheck on that, say $100,000 of that from your corporation. You took $100,000 in personal income and you paid tax on it. You would be effectively taxed at almost 80% because of some things called, it's basically clawbacks is the word I would use. So there's something called Canada Child Benefit, Ontario Child Benefit, Ontario Trillium, the carbon rebate. There's another rebate for healthcare. There's another rebate for something else. But it's 10 rebates basically that you can look to. And all of these rebates effectively claw back when you exceed $30,000 in personal income. And it's all about personal income. They don't care what you do in your corporation. So you get $1 million in your corporation, doesn't affect these rebates. But it's to the point where, like, after $30,000 a year, if you make $30,000 a year, or you make $60,000 a year, the net after tax is very close if you have multiple children. The government pays in Canada $650 cash plus Ontario, so about $900 cash per child, tax-free into your account. It's effectively at my tax bracket like giving $1,800 a child pre-tax income per child, thousands of dollars a month. All of these, folks are coming here from other countries. They come here with 6 kids. They're collecting more than a doctor or a lawyer would make sitting at home doing nothing. That's how the Canadian tax system is set up. And if they go get a job on the books, they're working off the books. A lot of them are doing contract work, taxi driving, whatever, things on the side and not reporting it. But if they were to be in a position where they were to go and get a job, they keep 15 cents on the dollar. 15 cents. What's the incentive for these folks to lose Ontario Child Benefit, Canada Child Benefit, the Trillium, the carbon relief, all of these benefits that you get for being lower income in Canada? And then all the tax on top of that they have to pay on every dollar. That every dollar they go out and work, if you factor in the cost of eating out, if they have to eat out once a week, and the cost of gas to drive to work, they actually lose. There's no incentive to work. What kind of system are they trying to cultivate in Canada? When people find this out, I'm hoping that people just don't know that. And maybe I'm part of the problem now if I'm sharing this. But I've had people apply now for some of our rental units to rent from us here in Canada. And I'm like, what's your proof of income? They're like, I make $5,000 a month in government benefits. Like, what do you do? Like, well, I have a face tattoo and I have a disability because I'm emotionally traumatized from my childhood and I have 5 kids. Like, but what do you do? Like, no, I just milk the government for $5,000 a month because I'm emotionally traumatized and I'm woke and I have 5 kids. And that's an actual application we got. And they showed bank statements, like $5,000 a month coming in. I'm like, what? You have 5 different baby daddies? And that's not even child support. They were getting child support on top of that. It's like, what kind of country have we built? Even if the parents pay nothing, the government, Uncle Sam, Uncle Trudeau, Uncle T is going to get in there. He's going to pay you to have kids and sit at home and do nothing. And if you work, he will claw back that benefit so hard and tax you to the point where it isn't even worth it to work. Who wants to go work a $20 an hour job when your net is $1.50 an hour? You make $1.50 an hour, your gas is more to drive around for work and your cost of your clothing and everything else. I can see why people aren't working, right? It's definitely something that I don't know. I don't know what to do. I don't know what the right answer is, guys. I will say that it's concerning. It's troubling. And I'm going to go to the Q&A real quick. I just want to get that out there that I think that we really need to have a political change here. In the United States, looking at their data, it's been really interesting. My shorts have really printed. I think my account's up 38% the last week alone because I did keep some shorts, thankfully, that have gone like 10-1 in my favor. I was right. My timing was wrong. That we are due for a pullback, a really, really overdue pullback. We had such a rally that this is like a natural correction. We needed this so badly. The market is realizing that we're going for higher for longer, that rates aren't going to cut in 2020. They didn't cut in 2023, and they aren't going to probably cut in early 2024. In the United States, there is actually a resurging inflation right now, geopolitical risk of war, and a number of other risks that make it possible that rates are higher for longer, and that the target inflation of 2% seems more and more elusive. In fact, the Fed's Jerome Powell in the United States even came out as far as saying like the date and timeline for us getting to a 2% return to a 2% increase in inflation each year is now like an elusive target. He hasn't even set a date for it. Used to be it was 2024 was the date, then 2025 was the date it was going to happen, then 2026, for sure by 2026. So from 2021 and 2026, he's okay with 5 years of inflation at 300%, the 2% target. What that does is erode all of our purchasing power. It makes life and the world basically not go round. Like, we need a stable dollar. We need to price projects in business. Most projects take 2-3 years. There are ways out. When you're trying to price projects, you have to be able to price all your costs inputs. And when you don't know, when inflation's unanchored, you don't know what inflation's going to be next year. Is it going to have a 4 handle on it or a 2 handle on it? It's really hard to do business. And it actually creates a spiral where people are demanding more from their work. And you end up in a price wage spiral. And the economy, I don't think, can support that. Maybe it can. I guess we're going to find out between that rock and that hard place. But what a eventful week. A lot has been going on. I'm probably missing some of the updates, but there's been a lot of economic data, a lot of big tax reform in Canada, a lot of things that have been boiling over, and I'm glad to share them with you guys today. Let's go to the Q&A and see what's up in your world and what you'd like to have answered. Hey, Johnny Bahama, how you doing? David, how you doing? Do you still have your 25 and free blog? No, I stopped paying for the domain. I probably should bring it back out. I used to have a bunch of articles on there. It's something I could bring back, the blog. Randy says, hey, Mike, hope you're well. If a property doesn't cash flow at 20%, would you consider putting a higher amount down so it does cash flow? Or is this the sign of a bad buy? It depends. Like, in general, I would say you want to buy property that cash flows. But in this market, there are some unique opportunities that don't cash flow now that will cash flow when rates fall. Now, rates falling might not necessarily be a good thing. It is a good thing if they come down with inflation, but if they start bringing rates down because the economy's in disaster, which is usually what happens. Usually when there's an inverted yield curve like we've had, there may be opportunities during that inversion of the yield curve before things correct, typically where we go into a recession, where you can buy deals that might not make sense now that make a lot of sense later. And so there will be some opportunities, I think, to pick up asset classes that are potentially not cash flow positive now, but that will yield great returns later. So I could see an argument for someone buying something that might not be cash flow positive now, but that has a big lift. Like, I'll give you an example. Maybe a 10-unit building that you're buying that has, an opportunity to bring the rents up by 100% over the next 5 years because rents are already low and it needs to be improved. And so there's a plan there to go from negative cash flow to positive cash flow. Or you buy a building and there's an opportunity to split it in half and add a unit or add several units. Once you do that conversion, then it could make sense, right? So if there's a value add component to the deal in this type of market, the value add component might require that you go through 6 months of fighting with squatters to get them out, or non-paying tenants or bums to get those people out. And in Canada, that is a struggle. It almost always is just easier to go the easier route, give them cash for keys. Sometimes it makes sense just to evict them, plain and simple. I don't know what the right answer is for your property, but there's been a lot of landlords right now, and I feel for them, where they pick up the job, because real estate is a job. Let's be honest here. People say it's passive, but it's not really passive. When you first buy a property, there's a lot of download and a lot of headache and a lot of issues you have to fight with to stabilize the asset. And stabilization is both cash intensive and time intensive. So when you first buy a property, it's time intensive and cash intensive. Over time, it can become a great passive asset once you've worked all the kinks out, got it how you want. Most times, by the time I get it to where I want it to be, it's worth so much more money that I just want to sell it and move on to the next thing. So that's a flaw, I guess, of my personality styles. I'm always chasing that higher yield. And it's part of what's made me so successful. That's taken me from 0 to 8 figures, right? And it's what's going to take me to 9 figures and 10 figures is that drive, right? Not a lot of people want that in their life, that stress and that headache. But I guess suffice it to say, the answer is maybe. And that doesn't mean you buy a turnkey property that is, potentially has no upside at all and no cash flow. That probably doesn't make sense. There's got to be a lift there, I think, in this market. There is so much opportunity that look for the right opportunity is such a big piece of it. So I would say if it's just a standard rental property with no value add, you need to be buying stuff that cash flows unless you've got a specific reason why you're jumping in at said price. Hey, Will, how you doing? Sam, 100% agree with both your points there. Mort says, how would you strategize as an individual and as a corp to deal with the new cap gains? So it's going to change things, interestingly. I think that, at least at the face of it, what we'll see is less deals done in corporations and more people investing in the personal names, because I believe it's $250,000 per individual. I don't have the clarity on this. I haven't read the tax code in depth, but I read some articles on it and just to prepare for the show today. And I believe that, what we're seeing is that probably assets for the middle class and the upper middle class will shift out of corporations and trusts to an extent into personal names to an extent, because each person gets $250,000 per year of the old 50% inclusion. So they're actually giving individuals quite a benefit. They're really coming after corporations and holding corporations and anyone who's trying to invest in real estate outside of their personal name, which is anyone who's wealthy. So they're just coming after the wealthy effectively. If you're not wealthy, it largely isn't going to affect you. It will affect like the average person when they go to sell, a bunch of properties, when they go to retire or something in their personal name. That would potentially affect someone. So some of the consequences in strategizing of this is people may start buying assets in their personal name. I could see people also creating like additional corporations and running things as more active businesses as opposed to capital gains structure. A lot of people are fighting for capital gains treatment. I think less people will fight for the capital gains treatment and more people might start fighting for, hey, this was an active gains flip. It wasn't a property that's for capital gains. So I think that might come out in some ways. Mort, we might see some of that. I'm sure there'll be additional tax planning that'll come out of this. I'm not an accountant, so I can't think of other strategies off the top of my head, but I'm sure that people always, they say don't let the tax tail wag the dog, but people are going to let the tax tail wag the dog, meaning they will let the changes in tax rules and compliance decide how they structure and how they invest. So people try to say don't let the tax tail wag the dog, but it will wag the dog to an extent, and it will have impacts on, I think, the entire market overall. So it's interesting to see how that is going to play out. In some ways, for the bottom half of Canadians, these policy decisions are actually really good because inflation's running wild. Groceries are up 40% since 2020. The buying power of the Canadian dollar has lost 45% in 4 years, effectively on housing, on most food purchases. I was looking at it, like some of the core and super core inflation items, and it's like, wow, Canadian dollar has lost a lot of power. The US dollar has lost more than a quarter as well. So it's lost a lot of power too. Not near as bad as the Canadian dollar, but has lost quite a bit of power and buying power, sorry, is the word I'm trying to use here. So it's really interesting when we look through that and we think to ourselves, like, how is this going to play out in the years to come, and how do we protect ourselves? And I think hedging is super important for that. And it's interesting to see the bottom half don't have a lot of assets and a lot of control over their lives. And so how do they go and hedge for this crazy inflation? Well, the government is trying to take from the rich and give to the poor. And in some ways, I'm in support because, well, it's going to end up affecting them in the long term negatively. Like, it will decrease the economic productivity, it will cost jobs, it will hurt the economy, and it will ultimately hurt the people who are working in the bottom half in the long term and their kids. But in the short term, it may generate some additional revenue that Trudeau could kick back to them in terms of these $4,000 and $5,000 a month kickbacks that these people are getting. It's crazy. There's a whole subset of people, maybe it's the bottom 20% in Ontario and in Canada, they're living just on government benefits, several $1,000s a month. They don't do anything for the economy. They're a net drain. All they do is take. They don't give anything to the world. And that's a shame because all of us are born with talents that we can provide to the world, with gifts. And I think we should all be incentivized to give and to share. And I hope that, in the future, governments will consider that like, we want to incentivize people to give and to share and to contribute to the economy. We do better when we all work together. And it doesn't work when you crush your top producers. The people who have straps on their shoulders and are pulling the economy, like friggin' workhorses. When you whip them and then give the fruits of their labors to the people sitting in the back of the sled, dragging their feet, it's really a morale killer, and it kills the economy. Let's be honest, the top 1% drive 80% of all tax revenue and about 2/3 of the entire economic output. So you're really attacking your workhorses, and I think it's a mistake. I think it's a policy mistake. I can see why people are doing that. The growth between, when you make bad decisions in life, it compounds. When you make good decisions in life, it compounds. So as an example, when I was 17 years old and I started working a full-time job while going to school, I was just like, what can I do to set myself apart? Well, I worked an extra 30 hours a week when I was 17 that other people didn't work. That extra 30 hours compounded though. I didn't just make an extra $20,000 that year working. Well, I invested that. And over my lifetime, it's on 100x, right? So by the time I'm 65, that 1 year when I was 17, choosing to work, well, they partied and drank, and I chose to work on the weekends, 2 10-hour shifts at a part-time place. That decision, even if I did nothing else for those 3-4 years while I was a student, from 17 to 21, I went 4 years to college, university. Well, I worked harder than everyone else, working a full-time job while going to school full-time. That difference over my lifetime will be maybe $10, $20 million. So small decisions compound in a big way. Bad decisions early on in your life compound in a big way too. Everyone's like, I just want to party in my 20s, I just want to enjoy my life. That kind of mentality will screw you later on. So it's interesting, I think, in a lot of ways. People don't think about delayed gratification. They don't think about how our society today is so short-sighted. They're like focused on the now, focused on tomorrow. They're not focused on next year, on 10 years from now, for their kids, the next generation. And so I think it's important that we have that long-term mindset and the consequences of decisions that we're making today. And so to some extent, I'm okay with tax. Like I'm okay with, I pay a lot of tax in Canada. Not this year, because of course I have all these losses from the shorting of last year. But in general, I've paid a lot of tax in my life, and I've given a lot of value to other people, and I'm okay to do that as long as the money that I'm giving is going to the right places. And I don't think that it is. I would love to see real effect and real change and proper stewardship over the money that is paid. I have no problem. Like, if they told me a quarter of my wealth to go back to supporting other entrepreneurs and helping people grow and give them skills and that sort of stuff, I don't mind paying. But if you're going to line the pockets of a rich bureaucrat, I mean, and then some horrible policies that reward drug abusers and mentally ill, people who are just going to blow it and do nothing towards the economy. I mean, we need to have help for these people. Don't put money in them. Don't give them money. Give them help. Give them change. Give major reform. I don't know, just some ideas. Randy says, if you get paid in USD, would you keep it on USD or would you convert it to Canadian while the exchange is getting low? You could convert a portion. I think there's a chance, not a good chance, but there's a chance that, CAD to USD is 138. It's near highs. I think we might see 146 again. I really do think the Canadian dollar is not going to do well relative to the US dollar in the next year or two, just because our economy is so weak. When rates get low again and we get back to the 3% type rate environment, hopefully we get there, fingers crossed, due to going through a recession. But the rebirth of coming out of that, I think, will be fruitful for Canada. And in a year and a half, Justin Trudeau has 15% of the popular vote. So 85% of Canadians don't like him as our prime minister. If we had a referendum election right now, he would lose for sure. And he's going to be gone in a year and a half. And I think usually we switch from like being left to being right. So we'll probably switch to being a conservative leader as opposed to a liberal NDP government. We'll probably switch to a conservative majority, it seems like, in the polls right now. And I think that Pierre Poilievre will probably I don't want to say will. It's probably not true that he'll repeal what's happened, because I haven't seen it often. The governments, once they gain some power, they very often do not let go of it. When they gain some additional revenue or they gain some additional control, government just loves to grow. It tends to never shrink. So although I'm hopeful that, and he is probably the best person, has the highest chance of winning to actually do anything to help the economy of Canada, I don't know whether he'll repeal some of these changes, and I hope that he does. I really do. And there's a good chance that things do get better. And if that happens, I think that in a low interest rate environment, Canada can flourish. We have a lot of really great things going for us, but high interest rates are the heels of growth for the Canadian economy. We are just a very real estate heavy, very debt heavy nation, and low interest rates help us in a lot of ways to produce. So hopefully that makes its way around. I'm definitely personally keeping some USD reserves. Anything I make in USD, I'm gonna try to keep in USD. That's just for me having a bit of a hedge, just in case Canada doesn't go all the way. I continue to hedge my investment portfolio. I am heavily exposed Canadian. So how do I handle that? Well, I could buy hedges, I could buy options to protect myself. It sucks because we're at all-time highs, and I think it's gonna get worse from the Canadian dollar relative to other dollars like the US dollar. So I don't know what the answer is, to be honest with you. I don't know what the right solution is, but I think putting all your eggs in one basket is a dangerous, dangerous game. So spread your eggs around, convert a percentage of your dollars if you have them all in USD, some to Canadian potentially. We're at all-time highs. It may go higher, it may get worse. At some point, it will get better. I do strongly believe that Canada has a lot of potential to be one of the top 10 best countries in the world. And I think it's still in the top 20. We're losing, in certain areas we're really losing, but I think Canada has a lot of potential. In terms of raw potential, I think Canada has some of the best scores on several axes and metrics out there. We're a beautiful country. It's an amazing country. I love Canada. I just wish it was under better management. Hey, Mike, what do you think is the best hedge against risks like increasing capital gains? How do you build that risk into equities portfolio of aiming for a 4% safe withdrawal rate? Well, one of the ways you could do that is you could buy exchange traded funds or ETFs that are currency adjusted. So you can buy ones that are adjusted to Canadian dollar, adjusted to US dollar. So you can adjust for those risks. But you can build a portfolio that isn't just Canadian dollar. Remember, Canada is like 3% of the world's wealth. We control 3% of the world's total wealth. So if you just invest in Canadian assets, you're exposing yourself, you're missing out on 97% of the world's wealth exposure. That's a mistake, I think, if you're building a portfolio. So don't just have Canadian exposure. Please hedge and have different asset classes in your portfolio. Spread it around. You need to have a balanced portfolio. You need to be exposing yourself to US equities, to Brazil, Russia, India, China, emerging markets. Obviously India and China are powerhouses. Honestly, if I could have exposure to Russia right now, I would. I think Russia is undervalued. As politically horrible as that sounds, they're being constrained and squeezed. I held some RSX ETF. I had some exposure. The US government effectively froze that and liquidated that 1/100th of its value. Forced me not to be able to hold shares in Russian companies. And I wanted some exposure to Russia. I wanted 1% of my portfolio to have exposure in Russia. I think I had like $50,000 or $100,000 exposure to Russia, and they froze that and liquidated the ETF. That is fucked. I should be allowed to have exposure in every country in the world if I want to. I should be allowed to own some Russian exchange, some Chinese exchange. It's bullshit that I can't own those equities. And so I just think that Yeah, but the world is corrupt. And so how do you get around that? You invest in what you can. You get exposure how you can to various countries. It's important, I think, to have that global exposure. Wars happen, global powers rise and fall. You don't want all of your eggs in one basket ever. It's one thing I've learned in my life. You never want to have everything all in one basket. You want to spread it around if you can and have more than one bucket, more than one leg to stand on. If one leg gets knocked over, you have another one to stand on. Super, super important. So if you're going to build a really resilient 4% safe withdrawal rate portfolio that you can retire on, you can live on for the rest of your life, you want to be having exposure to many countries, to many different equities, and different asset classes, just in general. I think that's a smart one. And most important, I guess, is CM, to kind of answer your question, where are you going to retire? So if you're retiring in Costa Rica, you may need US dollars to support your lifestyle. So then you need to hedge to US dollar. If you're retiring in Canada, it's a different situation. You need to hedge your portfolio because you need to withdraw Canadian dollars to live. So again, it depends on where you want to be, where you are now. All of those things are really important to think about your holistic portfolio. Would you buy Canadian dividend stocks right now? I don't know. I do have a couple $100,000 in bank stocks right now, like a Bank of Nova Scotia. Bank of Nova Scotia is down 7.5%. It was at $70 Canadian a share, and now it's like 64. So almost might be 10% off the high. In the last 2 weeks, we've seen the stock dive 10%. That's pretty good value. I think the bank's trading at 9 or 10 times earnings, which is reasonable for financial stocks. I think there is value in the Canadian market. It may get worse though. So would I leverage? No, I wouldn't apply any leverage right now in this market. I would be very careful. I think I would nibble some. Doesn't hurt to have some in your portfolio. There is some value potentially there, but just be careful because again, the Canadian banks are very sensitive to how this rock and hard place cut situation is going to go with the Bank of Canada. David says, do you use the same mortgage broker when you invest in Ontario? It varies. To some extent, David, we do have, to some extent, we do have the same brokers we use. I'll have like 3 or 4 people that I always use. And when you get comfortable with someone, you continue to use them. I typically have brokers that are good for certain things. So I have a broker who's like a commercial broker. I have someone I like to use for, alt lending. I have someone I like to use for Scotia. I have private banking with Bank of Montreal as well. Depends on where I'm going, what I'm trying to do. So certain lenders have certain risk appetites. And I think working just with one lender only is a risk. Again, never have all your eggs in one basket. Governments try to please most people, so wealthier folks will always be screwed. Mr. Frugal, it's a fair point. In general, it's called tyranny of the majority. I don't know if it's an actual term in political science. I wrote an essay on it, I think in my first or second year of university, about tyranny of the majority. And I was like, it's not fair that the 51% can punish the 49% just because they have a majority. It's supposed to be tyranny of the minority when minorities go and like tyrannize everyone, the elite that control the world. But tyranny of the majority is real. A bunch of dumb idiots get together and are like, yeah, this is what's best, man. And like, I'm not going to say legalizing weed was that example because I could care less about that. But that was what got Justin Trudeau into office. People mostly voted, the young people mostly voted for him because they wanted to have weed legalized. They voted on one issue. They didn't consider any of the economic fallout, any of the policy decisions around immigration or the economy or fiscal policy, anything related to anything except that one issue. And that's tyranny of the majority. I'm going to make that a coined term where the 51% who are idiots, the mob herd, tyrannize the smart people. And I don't want to say that I don't believe in democracy, but some people maybe shouldn't be allowed to vote. I mean, you got to have a certain head on your shoulders and a minimum amount of education, I think, to be of sound mind to make these decisions. You have to understand the inputs. And if you haven't put the time in, I don't know if you've earned, there's been times where I thought about not voting because I haven't had the time in my local municipal elections, as an example. I don't typically vote. I have voted before, but sometimes I don't vote in my municipal elections because I just don't have the time to track all the candidates in my area. And it's like, if I'm not informed, I shouldn't have a right to vote because I don't have an informed opinion. I'd just be guessing. And I see so many old people lining up to vote and they're like, who should I vote for? I saw a sign here. I don't know what their name is. It's like, well, why are you voting then? You don't even know who the person is. I don't know. I don't get into political science again, but anyway. Weird times in Canada for sure. Weird times in the world for sure. Yeah, unfortunately, I agree. I think that should be an informed vote. That'd be smart. Thank you, Sam. Appreciate it. Next question was from Raz. Someone told me gas is going up 12% tomorrow. What would cause that? I believe it has to do with the new carbon taxes. I know Trudeau put in new rules where he's trying to tax the use of fuel in your home. gas at the pumps, any transportation companies. Basically, the cost of everything in terms of gas and fuel and heating your home is going up 10 to 30% over the last year. So that's just tax. That's not you with the actual the cost of the gas is now like 1/4 of your total bill. 3/4 of your bill is just fees, delivery, and taxes here in Canada. So that's a messed up reality of our current world. How that's going to play out, I think it's going to be negatively. Do you flip homes with your own money? Is that a bad idea to do? You can flip homes with your own money for sure. You can use private money to do it too. You can borrow money, use your own money. I've often used our own money as well as private money to do it. And yes, sometimes a flip takes a year, 10 months. Sometimes it takes 2 months. In the best case scenario, 30 days, you can have it on market. And by the 3rd month, you've sold it. That's a great scenario when that happens. Port City says, going to start buying, waiting for capitulation before June 24th. We may see some capitulation. I think we will see some properties go up for sale. It'll be an interesting opportunity to buy, I think. There we go. Some good points there on the political referendum of voting. I'm seeing some comments here on that. Yeah, the new carbon tax going into effect. Agreed. What do you think of precious metal? So Raz, good question. Gold and silver are near all-time highs. People are fleeing to safety assets because they're afraid that inflation's out of control. And rightfully so. The narrative for 2024 is inflation is rising. The January report in the US, the February report in the US, and the March report in the US were all higher than expected at a 0.4 month-over-month increase. So that's a 4.8% annualized read for January, February, and March. Now what's going to happen in April, I don't know. But typically in the summer, everyone's traveling. Price of fuel goes up. We're in the midst of a war at the same time, a geopolitical instability, right? We saw what happened last weekend between Israel and Iran. There's real conflict there. We're on the brink of potentially a World War III. So there's a lot of risk out there. You got to hedge your equities. You got to protect against that kind of thing happening, which could happen. There's a lot of volatility in the world right now. I think that the VIX, the volatility index, the VIX is a great play. The VIX is rarely above 20. And when it spikes above 20, you short that shit hard. The VIX is basically spikes whenever there's really bad instability in the world, there's fear. It's never stayed elevated for more than 3 months ever. So the thing to do is as it spikes, you short the hell out of it. And then when people return to reality from freaking out, it goes back to a 12, 13, 14 read. It was just at 12 a few weeks ago. Now it's at 20, which means we're in recession territory. 20 plus read on the VIX is like correction territory. It's scary. It means something's really bad happening in the world and there's fear in the market. So typically, circle back to your question about gold and silver, I typically would never buy gold or silver when VIX is 18 plus, 20 plus. In general, there's too much of a premium. That's not always the case. That doesn't mean that gold won't go even higher yet. Doesn't mean the VIX won't spike to 35. We've seen that happen before where it spiked during COVID. I think it hit almost a read of 60 for a quick day and then bounced back. During 2008, it spiked briefly. We saw it spike again in 2022 when things crashed. So yeah, I mean, we're going to another spike. I don't know what the top is. If you're going to buy stuff, you're going to short it, definitely have a top. Definitely define your top and bottom. It's a safe play if you believe that the world's going to continue on. You short the VIX if you believe the world's going to continue on. If you think the world is going to crumble and fall to shit, I mean, maybe you'd long the VIX because then it'll just go crazy, right? I believe the world continues on. We find a solution. We work through any crisis. And so that's why I think it's a safe play to always be shorting the VIX when it spikes above 20. You use leverage to short the VIX when it spikes above 30. So we're in some interesting times right now in terms of opportunity. There's quite a bit of opportunity out there in this world right now. People are afraid and scared. And so fear is when you want to be greedy. When there's fear in the market, there is right now. We have a market sentiment on CNN. They have a fear greed index. I think we're a score of 36 out of 100 right now. For the last year, we've been 70 or 80 on the greed, very, very greedy. We're now in the very fearful section. So we're going into a correction territory that isn't necessarily an indicator of when the market will stop contracting. And it probably will keep going once it's done contracting. But it is currently contracting. We've seen the NASDAQ fall almost 5% off its high in the last couple of weeks. So there is some punishment that's happening. Tesla is down 40% from the highs. 40% of the company is gone. Apple's down now. We're starting to see some of the Magnificent Seven not be so magnificent in this little correction we're having right here. And I think that the smart, prudent thing to do is to slowly nibble at this dip because I think the world will carry on, but make sure you do buy a hedge because the floor could fall out at any minute. When you run up like we had 60% run up in tech, things can fall real quick too. And it's all bot, automated, algorithmic trading. So as things start to fall, they really start to fall. So just be careful. It's the world we live in now. Volatility is really high. Things are crazy. So just as an investor, you have to realize that the reactions are happening quicker and more extreme. Thanks to social media, people have less time to digest things, where the cycles are happening faster than they used to. It's like they're compressing with more volatility. That's just what I've noticed in general. Like in the 90s in Canada, in the real estate market, we had a 10-year drought. You bought a house in like 1991 in Toronto. By 2002, it was worth the same amount of money. Inflation adjusted, you lost in real estate by like 20%. It was a decade of no growth in housing. I think those cycles are going to happen faster now, but we could be in one of those cycles now where things are just flatlined. We're not going to be in a growth cycle like we had from 2016 to 2021. I don't know. If rates fall, we could have a boom again, right? It's again, very dependent on how things play out geopolitically. All right. We are in a cryptocurrency war. Hope you are prepared. Interesting. I'm along for the ride. I'm a hodler with a little bit of crypto. I'm not a crypto bro. I don't have a ton, but I have some exposure. Everything gets translated to the consumer, Sean says. Best way to save yourself is to consume less. Do more with what you have and get creative. YouTube is a phenomenal tool for people that like to learn. I love that comment. I wish I could pin that, Sean. That is the comment of the day for today. You want to be, as Jacob Lundfisker said in the book, Early Retirement Extreme, that I found when I was 17 years old, one of my favorite, it was like my, my go-to instruction manual for how to live life, was be a Renaissance man or woman. Learn to provide for yourself. Learn to provide value to the world. And when you give value, you will find you get a lot more value back. And that starts with less consumption, with minimalism. People consume way too much. You don't need the Starbucks. You don't need the fancy truck. You don't need the fancy car. You don't need the new iPhone or the iWatch. You don't need any of that shit. That's going to make your life worse, not better. Stay within your means. Learn to be self-sufficient. Provide value to the world, and you will be just fine. I loved that comment. It's my favorite one of the day. So that is my advice for everyone for today. I will take Sean's comment, and I will echo it again, and I will say, consume less. Inflation doesn't affect you near as badly if you don't consume. So there's a little tidbit of advice for you. Invest more. Bum, bum, bum. Be greedy when others are fearful. That's Warren Buffett's great advice, and Charlie Munger, and rest in peace. Boom, boom, fear greed index, boom, boom, boom. There you go. DCing into some nice equity plays. There you go, Will. Yeah, I mean, the fear index isn't a great thing to invest by, but typically when you're seeing a really high fear read, it's an okay time to start longing the market. Yeah, cool. All right, everyone. Thoughts on the spot Bitcoin ETF getting approved globally? I've heard of numerous countries getting on board. Yeah, I mean, that'll bring new capital into it. The problem, I think, is that it sort of defeats the purpose of Bitcoin, which was to get it into a decentralized system. If all of the governments own and control the supply, backed by BlackRock, and we use financial instruments and leverage to control the Bitcoin supply, and the challenge with that, Will, is that potentially there's a lot more volatility and more of a tie to tech and to tech markets. And what we wanted Bitcoin to act rather as more of an inflation hedge and a currency away from the government. So it's interesting to see how that's going to play out. It should bring new capital. All of the Bitcoin bulls are fully deployed. So what we as Bitcoin holders need is more people to pile in, right? And I think most of the people who want to pile in already are piling in. So it's really just about, if you want to see Bitcoin prices rise, it's really about finding people who will buy. And I think the boomer generation, if they were to deploy 1 to 3% of their net worth from, maybe split their gold allocation in their portfolio. Most people have a hedge of, commodities and gold and things that are 5 or 10% of their portfolio. If Bitcoin took even 1% of that, it's extremely bullish for Bitcoin. So Bitcoin has first mover advantage. There's also a bunch of bull cases for Bitcoin. I'm not a Bitcoin bull. I've never put more than 5% of my net worth ever in cryptocurrency. There's just too much volatility and pain and heartache. So, yeah, interesting to see. Japan, a lot of people talk about Japan. A lot of things going on in Japan recently. I promised these streams would be shorter, and this one went long. So my apologies for that. I was trying to be pithy and quick and do more of a market update, but then these end up going for an hour long. If you got value today, please hit the thumbs up button. Please jump in the comments and let me know. And the most important thing you can possibly do is share this video for me. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week. Remember, the secret to unlocking a wealthier you is 3 levers in control of your financial future. Starting in order of what you can control the most. Spend less. Spend less than you earn. Earn more. Go get off your ass and start a side hustle. Pick up an investment property, do something, learn something, pick up a book, spend less, earn more, grow the gap between what you're earning and what you're spending, and then go and maximize the returns on that capital that you're saving, and you will become wealthier. You'll have a better life. And financial independence is the dream that I want for everyone. There's nothing you can buy that's better than buying your freedom. And your freedom is for sale. It's up to you to buy it. If you want to buy your financial future, you get to buy it. It's 4% rule. Some people can argue with real estate, 8% safe withdrawal rate, which means you need to save up 10 or 20 years living expenses, and then you can retire off the passive income from that, never ever depleting the original capital. That's what I want for everyone. That is the financial dream. That's why I started this channel 7 years ago. It's why I continue every week without fail to go live for you guys and bring you that knowledge. And because again, it's all mindset. It's all in the way that you think and the way that you do, and the way that you think reflects in how you do. And so it's about taking action, and that's what this channel is all about. And so if you're getting value from that, please hit the thumbs up button, and please share these videos and tag me on social media. If you can share this on your Facebook, on your Instagram, and you got some value today, I would really appreciate it. It would mean the world to me. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you next week.